I call Councillor Sepuloni.
Mr Speaker, Labor will be supporting this bill because we will support any piece of legislation that's going to be about building more affordable homes in Auckland. Mr Speaker, what we recognise on this side of the House is that there is a housing crisis and first home buyers are locked out of the market, and it doesn't make sense to use prime land for grazing cows when it could be used for affordable housing. The development will also be a great opportunity for Ngāti Paua as a developer of the houses, so it's good to see their historical wrongs addressed through the right to build houses on this land and the provision of 2 hectares for the development of a marae. Ultimately, this is only 300 homes. Auckland is building 8,000 homes per year fewer than it needs, Mr Speaker. The government needs to step up and build more affordable houses. In fact, the new Prime Minister, Bill English, needs to show how he is going to fix the problems Key papered over, problems like the housing crisis that John Key refused to acknowledge was real, when the rest of New Zealand knows how real it is, particularly in their own lives or in the lives of families who are struggling to not only buy homes but get affordable rentals, Mr Speaker, or to find homes where their children can be healthy because of the state of some of the homes that have not been repaired by that government. Mr Speaker, we recognise that with this development it will mean a loss of green space for the community, and the government will need to work closely with the council to make sure that there are adequate facilities for recreation in the area. What we also recognise is that actually this is the 9th project in the government's underwhelming surplus Crown land scheme. And let's just point out a few of the other underwhelming ones. We've got Nick Smith, who promised 500 hectares of housing, with the first houses being built by the end of 2016. Here we are at the end of 2016, still only just confirming the sites, unlikely to have even a fraction of 500 hectares developed, and they haven't even started building the houses, Mr Speaker. The second example of the underwhelming nature of that government when it comes to housing is the early sites they identified for the Crown land scheme included ridiculous places they couldn't build on, including cemeteries, substations, and the Governor-General's house, of all places, Mr Speaker. And the third example of underwhelming housing schemes that I'd like to use is the program which was set back months by the government's refusal to recognise Ngāti Whātua's right of first refusal, resulting in a legal challenge, Mr Speaker. High Court, as my colleague Penny Henare has said. So it has been overwhelming, and at the moment it's just whatever we can support, no matter how underwhelming it is. We must support it because we do have such a huge housing crisis, Mr Speaker. It has spiralled out of control under that national government. We've got first home buyers, as I said, locked out of the market, and 41,000 people are homeless, Mr Speaker. That number has increased significantly under the national government, and they should be ashamed of themselves for it. Mr Speaker, New Zealand's rate of home ownership is the lowest it has been since 1951. In fact, for the Pacific community, who have the lowest rate of home ownership now, it's something like 18%, Mr Speaker. The Auckland house price has more than doubled since National took office to over $1 million in Auckland, and the crisis is now spreading around the country. As people move out of Auckland because they can't afford to live there, then the house prices in other parts of the country are starting to skyrocket as well, Mr Speaker. So this is not just an Auckland issue. The housing crisis is a national issue. In fact, it's a national government's issue, if only they'd recognise that. Mr Speaker, 1 in 7 Auckland houses are now sold to major property speculators. 78% of renters cannot afford a deposit on the average New Zealand home. This is over 1 million people locked out of home ownership. 35% of offshore speculators pay no tax on their rental properties because of tax write-offs. And English and Bennett are focusing on selling estate houses instead of building new ones, despite the Horowhenua and Invercargill sales falling through. I saw a really good example of what's happening with Housing New Zealand and state housing when I was in New Plymouth recently, where there was a development that was meant to take place. Jonathan Young is in the House. He's done nothing to address this issue. a development that was supposed to take place. They were promised back in 2008 that those houses would be bowled down, but new houses would be built on that land, that there would be a higher rate of provision in terms of Housing New Zealand houses, and instead it is now 2016, 8 years later, under that national government, and nothing's been done except some of those houses have been knocked down, some of them have been boarded up, but nothing new has been built there, and there is less of a provision of state housing than what there was when that government started. Now, when I put through an OIA to try and find out why that was the case, I get the response back saying that there's not the demand for Housing New Zealand houses. Well, Mr Speaker, there is the demand for Housing New Zealand houses. You only need to speak to the emergency shelter in New Plymouth, member for New Plymouth, Jonathan Young, and you find out that they've had a 33% increase in the number of people having to access emergency shelter because they're not able to access Housing New Zealand or any other housing. So the only reason that it looks like there's less of a demand on Housing New Zealand is because the government have made it harder to get on the Housing New Zealand register. And so they use that as a reason not to develop the houses, and it's disgusting to think that in the context of this national housing crisis, here we have these empty, boarded up homes, as well as houses that have been knocked down, so a whole lot of land free, where houses could be built by the government to house these people who need housing, and yet nothing has been done. The member of New Plymouth should be ashamed of himself for not advocating for his constituents like he should have. Mr Speaker, so pointing out all of those things, I need to also just point out the fact that Labor does have a plan. This housing crisis is real, we recognise that. We've got a plan to address it. Labor has committed, we committed a few years ago, we continue to maintain this commitment to ensuring that every New Zealander has a wide, warm, dry, affordable home. And we take that so seriously that actually that bill was put in under our leader, Andrew Little's name. We have talked about the fact that we will be building more affordable homes, 100,000 over 10 years. The government think that that's too aspirational, but we don't think it's too aspirational. We think it's achievable, actually, because we are the party of aspiration. And we have talked about fixing Auckland's planning rules, cracking down on speculators, and giving more support for those in need. That is real aspiration, Mr Speaker. That is real aspiration, and that's what New Zealand wants to see. A party, a political party that actually will address the serious issues and challenges that we face as a country. And I see Jonathan Coleman yelling at me from across the room. There's a reason why he was not selected by his colleagues to be leader of the National Party, Mr Speaker. There's a reason. So maybe just for the next couple of days he should potentially just sit there quietly for a little while and reflect on whether or not he is actually as popular as what he thinks he is. Thank you very much.
I call